So I'll turn this over now to Doug Berger, and please help me welcome him in our gathering.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tony. Good morning. I guess you can hear me since I'm all wired up, hopefully. Well, I guess the fact that I'm here is a bit of a surprise, but a very welcome one, and I really appreciate the invitation that Tony has extended to me to join you and speak with you. When Tony asked me what I could present on, the topic came to my mind right away, and talking about the relationship between surprise and awakening in Chan Buddhism. Chan is the sort of the Chinese pronunciation of the character which perhaps you're more familiar with as Zen, as it becomes Zen Buddhism in Japan. I don't have a paper prepared or a PowerPoint prepared or anything like that. I haven't done any sort of full-length work on this kind of a topic, but it was involved in some papers I recently wrote, as well as the book manuscript that I've recently worked on. I guess, if I were to, take a truly Chan Buddhist approach to helping to communicate how important surprise is in practice, I would, sort of put my shoes on my head, or cut my finger off, or have Tony throw me out of my chair or something. The way that Chan Buddhism works is that you would, and becomes a tradition in the first place, is that, sort of in this particular context, when you're expecting a talk, I would do something like that, and obviously you would all talk about it, and probably, at least on a blog post, someone would write about it, and if enough of us did that, we would have a koan collection. That's how Chan Buddhism works, basically. I think it's good that we're getting good press, and so in the interest of keeping it good press, I'll restrain myself from doing any of those things, and just try to talk you a little bit through this. Chan Buddhist thought and practice in the late Tang Dynasty and the early Sung Dynasty, so we're talking about 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, about that period. Very, very overtly and dramatically employs the emotion of surprise as something that could and does facilitate awakening. One of the things that Tony told me in inviting me to this is you don't have to attempt to answer the question whether or not surprise is an emotion. But the Chan Buddhist authors and practitioners of this period clearly considered it to be one, and considered it to be an emotion that could break the patterns and habits of other kinds of emotions in such a way as to facilitate awakening. Now, these kinds of issues are very difficult to talk through in a certain way. For one reason, one of the reasons it's difficult for me to talk through is because, well, if we're looking for people who are awakened, I'm not it. So I can't speak from that particular perspective. I think the other difficulty has to do with it really takes a kind of a very strong familiarity, I think, with the history of Buddhism as a tradition, the history of Buddhism as it's transmitted from Indian to Chinese culture, and all of that to really get a handle on that. But I will. What I want to do today, and I'll try to take a brief approach because I don't want to cut into anybody's lunch, but I will try to talk a little bit about why Chan Buddhist thinkers and practitioners seized upon surprise as a possible affective facilitator of awakening. And then I'll give some examples, actually, of how they went about doing that, actually how they went about incorporating surprise into their monastic pedagogy in very, very overt and dramatic ways. And then I'll try to talk a little bit about, mostly basing my talk on a particular Chan Buddhist text that's very well known from the tradition. It's a Sung Dynasty text, although it's based on the teachings of a late Tang Dynasty master named Lin Ji. It's the Lin Ji Yulu, which is the recorded sayings of Lin Ji. And one of the things that's very helpful about that text is that there's a very extended discussion that goes through several sections about precisely this pedagogy of how we go about using surprise to facilitate enlightenment. So I'll just talk through some of these things and hopefully get through them as quickly as I can, and then we'll open it up for a little bit of discussion if we have time. So the goal of Buddhist thought, Buddhist practice, is awakening, right? It's known as bodhi, right, in Pali and Sanskrit. And it literally means that. Bodh is, the verbal root bodh means to wake up, right? Now, even in early Buddhism, the notion of awakening is very, very strongly associated with the breaking through and transcending the compulsive force of habits. In sort of straightforward language, when we're doing this in intro class, we talk about Buddhism and karma, right? Well, karma literally means action, right? But it's also very closely aligned with another concept in Buddhist thought, in early Buddhist thought, which in Sanskrit is called samskara, right? Samskara actually it's pretty much the same word as the word Sanskrit. They pretty much mean the same thing. It has to do, kara is sort of action, right? And sam is a collection, right? So it's a pattern of accreted action, which includes the psychological tendencies that prompt people to act, right, in various ways. So the idea in early Buddhism, and it really carries through to the rest of the tradition, that the patterns according to which human beings act are largely acquisitive in nature. That's to say, they gather around desire. And in the long run, living life as a pursuer of desires will make us unhappy, right? Will cause us pain. We can get short-term success and joy and pleasure, perhaps in two fashions, in monastic practice. Now, one other thing I want to mention is that the fact that surprise, even shock, incredibly anti-normative kinds of shock and surprise, are used in Chan Buddhist pedagogy. The other thing that one has to understand about the monastery is that by the time Chan Buddhists developed these techniques and began employing them, and we find them recurrent in their literature and their practices and their philosophical discourses, by the time that happens, there had been a very thoroughgoing monastic code that had been developed by Zhang in the 8th century and early 9th century. And with regard to the Chan Buddhist monastery, this made life in the monastery extremely routine. Really thoroughly routine, right? So you would get up in the morning and you would have your very, very modest breakfast, and in the Chan monastery you had to work. That was one of the innovations of Chan Buddhism, that you would work for your food rather than merely being a supplicant and begging all the time. So you do all kinds of labor in the monastery that has to do with growing crops and planting and things like that. Manual labor around the monastery for the upkeep and so forth. And then you would go into the meditation hall and you would meditate for hours on end, during a day. And very often at the end of the day, you'd fall asleep on the very mats that you had been meditating on, right? And then the next morning you would do it again, and so forth. So life is, and a lot of hours devoted to chanting and chanting sutras and all that kind of thing. So life is on the one hand is very, very is made into very strict routines. So the fact that shock and surprise is being introduced to this pedagogy is very important, because it's in the context of all of those very strict routines. Now, there are two pedagogical techniques primarily that Chan Buddhists use in order to attempt to employ surprise as a facilitator of enlightenment. The first one a lot of people have at least heard of, and perhaps know differing degrees about, and I'm not going to talk about it today because it's been written about so much. That's the gong-an, which is called in Japanese the koan, right? The gong-an literally means something like a public precedent in law. And basically it has to do with case records that grew out of early what is called by the contemporary scholar, the late Yanagida Seizan, as encounter dialogues. Chan literature grows through these extended dialogues, right, between teachers and students. And there are certain of those encounters, right, those conversations between teachers and students that become precedents for study. And then these koan, a lot of the very shocking dialogues that are using surprise and so on and so forth become canonized, actually, in official koan collections, gongan collections that are used for study. So that's one form of this. But I don't want to talk about that, first of all, because it's been talked about a lot, and sometimes confusingly, and I don't want to get into all those complications. But the other reason I don't want to talk about that is that the gongan, the koan literature, grew out of conversations that were crafted in a certain way in Chan monasteries. And those kinds of conversations or confrontations were officially called in Tang and Song Buddhist Chan literature Fa Zhan. Fa Zhan means Dharma war. Literally means Dharma war, the war over truth, or if you want to take Fa literally, the war over standards. Confrontations over standards. And it's really out of these confrontations that the interchanges that we find in koan collections grow. So it's the Fa-Zhan sort of stuff that comes first, essentially. So that's why I want to focus on it. And the other reason is that there's sort of a very clear, articulated pedagogy around these Dharma wars that we find in Linji's text, in Master Linji's text. So what I want to do is sort of start with a couple of examples. Not too many, but I'll start with a couple of examples. A couple of them come from Linji's text directly. A few of them come from some earlier texts. There's one example that I always like to use in intro classes that's fairly obvious. And it's fairly obvious how surprise is being used in that. And so it's a key maybe to help understand some of the later cases. So there's a teacher and a monk named Feng. And Feng has a problem. You know, he's been practicing Buddhism. He's a monk. He's been practicing Buddhism in the monastery for some time. But there's a certain kind of a psychological hang-up. We're not told what it is, but we all understand it, right? You know, on a certain level. You know, we're getting better and we're growing and so on and so forth, but we still have some kind of a hang-up so that when we confront some certain kind of situation, we always react the same, and we always have the same obsession, and we end up having the same problems, and it doesn't matter whether we make new friends or move to another city. There are certain kinds of interactions, and we still have this hang-up, right? And we can't get past it. So Feng is having a problem like this. Now he doesn't want to ask his master directly about that. You can't be too direct about that kind of thing, because if you're too direct about that kind of a problem in a Chan monastery, you're probably going to get beat up. So the monk has to sort of formulate a story around it. So he comes to his master and he says, he formulates the problem sort of in the form of a koan. He comes to his master and he says, "Master, I have a problem." I said, "What is it?" He said, "Well, it's basically, I want you to answer a question for me. A long time ago, there was a cat, and it was mysteriously born inside of a glass jar. I don't know how it got there, but this cat suddenly appeared inside this glass jar. Now, every day that the cat lives, it grows a little bigger, and it grows a little bigger, and it grows a little bigger. And as you know, jars don't grow. So presently, the cat has a problem. He's grown so large that his paws and his little paws that are pressed up against the edge of this jar, and there's no more room for him to grow. So, Master, what I want to know is how the cat can escape from this jar without both the cat and the jar being ruined." So it dramatizes the problem, right, in that way. How do you get out of this dilemma? And the master responds by suddenly shouting the student's name. "Feng! Feng!" Shouting it at the top of his lungs. And the student is startled. And the student just says, "What? And the master says, "You're out." Right? Now that kind of uses this in a sort of an obvious way, right? It sort of illustrates how surprise is used in a fairly obvious way. But the other thing is that to get about this is it's what awakening really hangs on the response to the surprise. So the few other examples I'll use is a story about an interchange between Nandran and Nandran is a teacher, sort of is a famous teacher, and he comes in front of his students one day and he demands, so this is the thing, you're in a lecture hall, right? You're in a Buddhist lecture hall and the master gets up front of you, you're expecting a talk, right? But instead the master decides to confront you, to put you in a crisis, right? To use an unexpected question, really, to put you in a crisis, right? And force you to respond that you weren't expecting at all. So Nandran gets up in front of his students and he has a cat. He has a cat in his hands and he says, okay, I want you to expound the Dharma for me, tell me what it means to be awakened, and if you can't, I'm cutting this cat in half. So it puts the students in a crisis, right? In an incredibly anti-normative way. I mean, Buddhists are not supposed to go around killing animals, right? So everybody's so shocked that everybody hesitates. And nobody can answer. So Nandran cuts the cat in half. Now this story makes it to another master who's in a monastery nearby, Zhaozhou, right? And they said, well, this is what happened, you know. And as soon as he hears what happens with Nandran, Zhaozhou is sitting, you know, sort of, and he takes his sandals and he puts them on his head. And Nandran hears about this and said, well, if Zhaozhou was in my monastery, the cat would have lived. Right. So it's the response, right? And I'm going to talk more about this. Another example, the two other examples come from the Linji Lu. Well, I'll just use one of them since we're pressed for time. Linji, this is in a very early sort of example of Dharma war of Fajan, right? That comes out of the Linji. Linji gets up in front of his students and begins to lecture, and he starts to talk about one of his ideals for practice, called the Wu Wei Zhenren, the unranked genuine person. It says the unranked genuine person is within each one of you, and it's always going in. It lives on your flesh, and it's always going in and out of the gates of your face. And then a student raises his hand and says, tell us more. What about this Zhenren, right? This genuine person? And the master, you know, sort of gets down from his lecture stool and walks up to the student and grabs him and says, who the hell are you? So again, it's using this totally unexpected confrontation to provoke surprise, and the student is what's called, actually there's a very old expression used for it, is niyi. In this particular context that it's used, it means that someone's expectations are completely upset, right? They're completely foiled, right? So the student is flustered, and the student can't answer, right? And you know, sort of Linji throws him off and says, well, okay, you're a genuine person, but you're a real piece of crap, right? So this is sort of a failed encounter. So these are just a couple of examples of instances of this. You know, I'm not sure whether or not you should try them in your classrooms, but there they are, right? Now, why are these kinds of confrontations used, and what sort of value do they have? Well, in the Linji Yulu, there's a number of sections that expound on what this pedagogy is all about, right? What it accomplishes and what it does, and the particular way in which it's designed to cut through one's accreted habits to get one to respond in the right way. So the idea basically is that we are, in our normal conduct, and the language that's used, that Linji uses is to talk about this, is when we talk about certain kinds of our accreted habits and our accreted behaviors are fueled, and particularly our accreted attachments, are fueled, Linji suggests, by 4 different emotions, fundamentally fueled by 4 different emotions. Buddhists love categorizing things, and they love 4. So this is the, you know, sort of 4 different emotions. One of them is I, right, which is normally translated, well, in modern terms, is translated as love, right? But in classical Chinese, it means something more like care. Things that you care about, things that you're concerned about. As a transitive verb, I in classical Chinese means to care for, right? To care about or to care for. The next emotion is doubt, right? We're provoked by doubt. So we can be provoked into action and pursue deliberate preconceived goals on the basis of love, or we can pursue various things on the basis of doubt or anger, chen, right? So that we're, some kinds of our conduct are also, and our agendas and our social programs are fueled by hostility, right? Accreted hostilities of various kinds. And finally, joy, xi. There are things that give us happiness, things that give us pleasure, and so we tend to gravitate towards behaviors and goals that will reproduce that kind of pleasure for us, right? So that these emotions fuel different kinds of life patterns of activity that orient us toward our expectations, right, and our goals in various ways. And normally, we are, as Linji extrapolates, we're tossed about by our habits. Zhuang, we're tossed around, we're tossed about. The behaviors and the habits become compulsive. So the way you combat the problem of being compelled or acting under compulsion all the time is precisely by another way of compelling you, right, into a crisis, another way of putting you on your heels, right, another way of interrupting, right, those expectations and controverting them. And this is done through these shocking ways of upsetting your expectations, right, and forcing you to respond. Now, the response that shows that you're not making any progress is hesitation. Being in a position where, and this kind of hesitation in the face of an unprecedented event, an unexpected event, an unexpected crisis. This hesitation is thought to be, as far as Linji puts it, it takes the form of an illness. And the illness is said by Linji to be located actually somewhere very specific in the body, right beneath the heart and right above the diaphragm. And these are kinds of illnesses that were considered and classified in ancient Chinese medicine to be fatal, right? You have a chronic illness that actually causes your death, right? And what it signifies is an inability to deal with the unprecedented, the unexpected in experience. That, you know, when you're confronted by, and that's a problem as far as Chan Buddhists are concerned, because the actual dirty little secret about experience is that every experience is unprecedented. So that if you can't deal with the unprecedented, the unexpected, the new, and the novel, and if you can't engage with it in a fairly direct way, then your life is going to be beset by problems, a continual inability to deal with the novelty of experience, right? That can't be formulated in a doctrine, not even a Buddhist doctrine, which is why Chan Buddhists go around talking about, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. If you meet the patriarchs on the road, kill them. And Buddhist, Linji really gets, you know, filthy about it, you know. I mean, he uses terrible language and calls Buddhist monks hitching posts for asses and all that kind of thing, right? You even have to uproot those kinds of obsessions. Now, if you can respond in a way that allows, now the context for this is interesting because what you have here is interactions between people. That's to say, interactions between two xin, between two heart minds. Interactions between people in this framework are what actually facilitates awakening. Not studying scriptures, not, you know, sitting in meditation and so on and so forth. It's a way of crafting interpersonal interaction as the framework, right, for awakening to take place. So that the way that you transcend these is to find ways appropriate ways to respond in the moment, to find an unprecedented way to respond to an unprecedented situation, right? Now, how that's supposed to, there's not an exact formula for it, right? Which is one of the things that makes Chan practice so tricky. But it's also a moment for the xin, right, the heart-mind, if the problem is responded to immediately, to be directly in a particular situation. Now this conforms to the Chan Buddhist ideal, particularly given the way that Linji talks about the normal functioning of a healthy heart-mind. In just going around in everyday conduct, looking at things and hearing things and putting on one's clothes and doing all the everyday things. Awareness tends to work in a perfectly fluid way that responds to its circumstances when the xin, this is the way that Linji describes it, when the xin, the heart-mind, inhabits or is found at or in, the word is tai, right? It's found at or in the appropriate part of the body that's being engaged by an experience. So when you really see things, the xin, the heart, fully inhabits the eyes. And when you're hearing correctly, the xin or heart or mind fully inhabits the ears, and so on and so forth. So it's a matter of making xin directly attentive and responsive to the immediacy of the situation, rather than acting on the basis of habituated compulsion. Right. And there are four possible kinds of encounter, right? So in other words, the encounter between two persons is described in this pedagogy as the encounter between a host, a zhu, which is sort of like the lord of a house or the master of a house, the host, right? And a bin, a guest, right? So you have the conversational situation and you have a host and a guest, and you have four different kinds of possible seeing or seeing through. Different people see through one another. So if in a situation of the host being, the host seeing through the guest, the host, sort of presents the guest puts the guest in a particular kind of conundrum, and the guest sort of hesitates and doesn't respond, looks for some kind of patterned response, right, accreted habitual response to deal with the thing, and fails, right, fails to respond immediately. That's the host seeing through the guest. But sometimes the guest, it's generally assumed to be the student, sometimes the guest gets the better of the host, too. So the student can better the teacher. And as a matter of fact, in Chan monastic practice, eventually the master expects the student to better them, right? That's what's supposed to happen. That's a sign that the student is becoming more awakened. Sometimes they respond to one another in such a way that intimates that both parties are awakened. That's a situation where the host is seeing the host. So the other example from the Linji Yulu is Matsu, who's actually one of Linji's teachers, who's attending one of Linji's lectures, and Linji says, well, okay, what about the bodhisattva of compassion with 1,000 eyes? And then Matsu responds by walking up to the instructor's seat, right, the lecturer's seat, and asks Linji the same question. What about this bodhisattva? Linji's about to answer, and Matsu picks him up and throws him off the seat, right? And Linji gets up and walks up towards Matsu and says, how are you? And Matsu is about to answer, and then Linji throws him off the seat, right? And then Matsu leaves the hall, and Linji gets off the seat, right? So they're both sort of they're kind of rejecting the proposition that they have to give a practiced answer, right, an expected answer. So that's a case of the host seeing the host. There are some times when the whole encounter fails, right? When someone asks someone a question out of their own attachment, and then the respondent doesn't know how to get out of it themselves, and the whole encounter just fails. And so that's a case of a guest seeing a guest, right? And so there are these different possibilities of encounter, and you find techniques to just immediately clear habituated obsessions out of the way. And this, in the end, is something that, when it's cultivated over a prolonged period and practiced, can produce something that's called xin, which is another pronunciation of the same character, but it means trust. Now, xin is another word in classical Chinese philosophy that had a long history, and a particularly important one in Confucian thought. In Confucian thought, xin is a moral category. It means being able to trust others. How do you know how to trust others? Well, the Confucian formulation is someone is trustworthy, you can place their trust in them, and you yourself can become a trustworthy person if your deeds match your words. You don't trust someone whose deeds don't match their words. So that in classical Confucian thought, xin is a relational category and a moral category, right? About finding people trustworthy. Linji thinks that one of the most important cornerstones of enlightenment is to enable the person, the individual person, to have xin in themselves. And the sign of a lack of awakening, right, is precisely the fact that the person doesn't trust themselves to deal with the immediacy and novelty of experience. And that's what the process of Fa Zhan, of Dharma war, is supposed to be able to correct. So surprise is intentionally cultivated and used. And what surprise does in optimal circumstances is it transforms the xin, it transforms the heart and mind of a person from the condition of being what we call zhuang, tossed about by emotions and habits, to being able to what's called yong, use them. So the enlightened person is not a person that's divested of feeling. It's not that you want to get rid of love or care. It's not that you want to entirely get rid of even doubt, right? It's not that you entirely want to get rid of joy, right? But this kind of a practice is a sort of a training that enables you, instead of being tossed about and compelled by those emotions, it enables you to use or employ those emotions in interactions with one another, so that one's interactions with others can be ongoing opportunities for awakening. So I think I'll go ahead and stop there, and I'd be happy to hear your responses or reflections or questions. Thank you very much. Well, I think there's a recognition that a kind of a schizophrenic crack-up in the course of practice is a danger. Later authors in Chan Buddhism talk about being overcome by Chan illness. There's a certain kind of an illness that might result from Chan practice itself. And even later Japanese authors talk about people getting stuck in a ball of doubt, right? That kind of thing. So there are presumably, well, certainly in Chan and Zen Buddhist discourse, wayward reactions, right, and wayward conditions that can result from this kind of a practice. And sometimes it happens, right? I mean, sometimes it happens with students who go mad. In some cases, they have to be expelled from the monastery. In some cases, they have to be medically treated, right, in some ways. In some cases, they have to be transferred to another teacher. Sometimes facilitator and student relationships just don't work, right? I mean, all the sort of cues are missed and intentions are missed and so forth. So there's a possibility for that. And so teachers, I think, are expected to be particularly attuned to that kind of thing. The two things that I think Chan Buddhists really try to rely on to prevent that kind of a thing. The first thing is a built-up intimacy in the student-teacher relationship. So that once koan collections, for instance, were established in many different Chan monasteries, certainly the monasteries that that grew out of this line of teaching from Linji, those are called Rinzai monasteries in Japan, is for the student and the teacher to have these sort of regular interview sessions where the teacher would give a student a koan to wrestle with, and the student would wrestle with it, and then you have this series of interactions, right, that are going. So there's a very intimate association, right, that's built up between the teacher and the student as the student struggles, right, and so the teacher is supposed to safeguard them. The other thing is that I think it's always important to keep in mind that this kind of practice occurs very specifically in a monastic context. And so it's not as if, you know, Chan Buddhists are sort of expecting people in society to, you know, sort of, you know, constantly throw off all of their norms, right, and all of their habits and so on and so forth. I mean, the other, and again, to bring this up, in the monastic context, the other large element of the practice, right, there are these interactions that produce this shock, right, and this encouragement to break past habits. But then the rest of the life is extremely normative, right? I mean, the rest of life is really, really dominated by routine, right? And I think that in a certain way, these two kinds of activities in concert are supposed to dilute the sense of ego. That's sort of that the Buddhists generally believe is at the source of all illness anyway, right? So I think there's a recognition in Buddhist practice that that's a real danger, and sometimes the danger is breached. I mean, sometimes students do go over the edge. It happens. It's dangerous, right? I mean, it's a dangerous kind of practice. But there are pedagogical techniques and student-teacher intimacy that are, you know, sort of employed to try to controvert that. But I think they would recognize that as a possibility. Yes. It's certainly an emotion, right? Because it's really described. I mean, there are different terms that are used in these situations to describe it, but there are different ways of describing the heart, right, as being arrested, right, or being sick, or being taken aback, or being tossed about, or being completely disoriented, or completely faltering, and so on and so forth. But the other thing that these kinds of experiences do is they, you know, Xin it also deliberates, right? It also the heart also thinks, and it cogitates, and it uses concepts, and so on and so forth. And one of the things precisely that these experiences are meant to do is to take all of that deliberating and planning sort of activity of the Xin and stop it, right? Force it to stop. So that there's a kind of an emotional response that requires, so other language that describes successful responses talk about someone mustering all their energy and passing through the crisis without a breath, right? So the response is supposed to be affective. It's really not supposed to be deliberate, and it's not even supposed to be communicated deliberately, which is why you find all this funny stuff about all these monks and nuns in monasteries shouting all the time, right? I mean, it's an affective response. Yeah, well, what comes before emotion and deliberation, as far as Chan Buddhists are concerned, with Xin is sort of a basic level of luminosity, right? So that the most fundamental mode of the activity of the heart is to manifest, right? To manifest the world, right? To manifest one's awareness, and does that through the sense organs, but sometimes does it through emotion, and sometimes, occasionally, even could do it through language used a certain way, do it through words used a certain way, and so on and so forth. So that what you want is to eventually to have that manifesting function of the heart take over, but that doesn't mean that the feelings and the thoughts are totally gone. It just means that the heart can use them, right, to manifest the world rather than be thrown around by them and dominated by them. Yeah. Pre-existing emotions. I mean, one of the things that actually the interaction that is fostered by this pedagogy is meant to do is precisely to tease out what emotions are there. So that when certain kinds of startling questions, right, and generally these fajan, these Dharma war encounters are precipitated by a question, right? So somebody, now it might be the student's question. The student's question itself might reveal some sort of fundamentally emotional problem that they're struggling with, or some kind of cognitive habit that they're hung up on, so forth. Or sometimes the first question can be asked by the teacher, right? And the student's reaction to the initial surprise itself is going to reveal what sort of underlying, sort of emotional problems are there. And for every student, of course, it's different, right? Every student has their own complexes and so on and so forth. So this kind of instruction is very precisely individualized, right, between the teachers and the students. Now, one of the things that's also true is that, as I mentioned, the guest can see the host, the student can get the better of the teacher. Even a teacher that's awakened in the Chan framework isn't necessarily, they haven't necessarily unraveled all of their emotional problems, right? They've had certain experiences and certain encounters that have revealed insight, but they might not necessarily be totally consummated and complete and so on and so forth, so that the student could get the better of them, right? So it's really the question and response process itself that sort of teases out what sort of pre-existing problems happen to be there. The other thing is that it's very often, it's often very telling in looking through recordings of these Dharma combats, right, in koan collections and also in the literature, because very often in the cases of what would be deemed a successful encounter, right, where someone was awakened, was actually meaning broke through their emotional hang-ups, right? The situation is so tense, right? I mean, the situation and the encounter is so provocative and so tense that in the case of a successful encounter, both the teacher and the student will burst out laughing, right? So that there's just be in fits and laughter and then kind of, smack one another playfully or something like that. That there's an incredible release of tension, and that release of tension itself is actually celebrated in the text, right? Where somebody broke through something. That something was resolved, right? There's another famous one that Tom Kasulis liked to quote all the time. I think it comes from a Japanese text, I forget which one, where these two monks standing on the edge of the world, right, as it were, and looking at everything that's going on. And the first monk is weeping. And the second monk asks him, "What's the matter?" And the first monk says, "Oh, look at that place. It's such a horrible place. They're all eating each other. You have to eat to survive, right?" So I mean, the life is this process of consumption and so forth. So the first monk is sort of overtaken by the grief of sort of the tragedy of what's necessary for life to continue to live in the world. And the second monk responds by saying, "Oh, don't feel so bad. They're feeding each other." Right. So that the same place of grief can also be a place where you see all this self-sacrifice in generosity to the lives of others, right? And that encounter also ends in laughter, right? So it's the response that's also very important, and laughter is very often the sign of a successful encounter. So. Just sort of fulfilling the demands of my role today, just giving you a Buddhist perspective on this. I mean, I think a Chan Buddhist response to that is, okay, you have all of these institutions and social practices that are devoted to certain forms of objectivity, right, as you're putting it in the carrying out of their discipline, but then the Chan Buddhist would immediately ask, why are you doing them? Why are you engaged in these disciplines? Why do physicians look for and researchers look for cures of diseases? Why do people engaged in various kinds of military technology continue to try to make better weapons, right? So that objectivity, I think the Buddhist response would be that objectivity is being employed, right, in these kinds of disciplines in order to achieve certain kinds of results and certain kinds of advances and certain kinds of progress. But the grounds upon which one engages in those practices are fundamentally affective in nature, right? I mean, we wouldn't look for better medicines if we didn't care about one another, and we wouldn't develop better bombs if we didn't hate one another, and so on. And that there's sort of affective problems at the root of all those kinds of objectifying tendencies. So one can't transcend the Chan Buddhist view, and this is one of the things that would be unique about the Chan Buddhist view is that so those emotional bases of our activity, they're always there, and they can't be eliminated as long as the heart is living in a body. They're going to be there. That's part of the Shin's activity. So the important part about cultivation is not eliminating them or sidelining them or getting them out of the way so that we can get rid of our biases, but learning how to use them properly, right? Learning how to use them properly in order to help them, help us manifest the entire reality of a certain situation, right? The other thing that sort of objectivity can do is it sort of can make you tunnel visioned, right? And like the monk, sort of at the edge of the world who only sees death and destruction there's kind of just a focus on only a part of the problem. And if you are immediately engaged in manifesting a situation, you want to see the whole, right? You want to see the whole of the interconnections there. So I think those would be some ways that a Chan Buddhist would respond to that question. There were times and circumstances in which it became less effective because, sort of one of the things that very often did, not always, but one of the things that very often did, and sometimes still does, sort of predominate in a Buddhist monastery is that these koans, sort of in these encounters, they become very practiced. They become routine themselves, right? That's when the precedent becomes a precedent, right? The koan actually becomes a precedent, and you expect it. You expect to deal with it. Everybody knows what's in the koan collections now. It's not like they're mystery to students or something like that. And so, and that kind of defeats the purpose, right? So at least the earlier purpose for which the tradition was formulated was precisely to destroy the precedent, right? You were presented the koan precisely so that you could break past it, right? You wouldn't have to observe even the pattern that was established in the koan, right? So everything being pulled into this sort of formalized routine structure was a way that this could become and did become, actually, in many places less effective over time. So it's another danger. And you have to innovate within the practice of the monastery, right? In the concrete specifics of the relationship between the teacher and the students. But that doesn't always happen. I mean, these are not, the Buddhist monasteries are not any more perfect places than anywhere else, right? So I mean, it really depends on, I guess, the sagacity of the teacher, right? Practically all the descriptions of the reactions and so on are bodily. Right. I mean, they're formulated as bodily reactions, either as physiological symptoms, or as somebody, sort of, shrinking away in disgrace, or sort of people doing, sort of unexpected things with their bodies, or doing unexpected things with the implements around them, and so on. It's practically all. Yes.
Well, also pointed on the left point, because Sarah also laughs, and mitzak is from laughter, with Latin, Hebrew laughter.
Yeah. So I think pretty much, sort of in looking through these collections, it's practically all the responses are bodily in various ways, either with regard to the way that the person reacts and comports themselves, or with respect to their physiological, psychological condition. They can become sick, they can become joyous, they can become amazed, and so on and so forth. It's all very, very thick sort of descriptions of reactions.
Okay, good. So, thank you, Doug.
Thank you very much.